Syria's transitional government has been in place for more than a year now and is facing increasing questions about stability and the integration of the Syrian democratic forces into state institutions. I sat down with Syrian UN Ambassador Ibrahim Olabi to talk about the challenges facing his government. I'm Frank Uciardo, and you're watching TRT World One-on-One. Ambassador Ibrahim Olabi, thank you for joining us here on TRT World.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
I want to ask you about recent development of another Israeli raid into Syrian sovereign territory. It was apparently in the Reconstruction province, which is an area in the Golan Heights. What exactly has taken place there?
Well, this is something that's been ongoing since December 8th in terms of these incursions. But the occupation of the Golan Heights has been going on for decades, and something that here at the UN we've spoken very clearly against. And we actually managed to shift votes for the very first time. We managed to get 123 states to vote on the occupation of the Golan and calling for Israeli withdrawal. We've spoken against this very loudly. They are kidnapping Syrian citizens. They are occupying more land, and so we're putting all the pressure that we can here diplomatically, and we are engaging in talks with the US mediated ones to say, look, if this is a security concern, this is something that we can address. But if it's more land grab, this is not something that we can tolerate.
Now, the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights said that just in February, there were at least 41 incursions into Syrian territory, including the really outrageous spraying of herbicides on farmland. That must have really hit home with a lot of the people in that area.
It has, and we are working very hard against it. We're using all diplomatic means that we can to push back. And diplomatic means putting a lot of pressure on Israel through their allies. And obviously there's a lot of interest in Syria from their allies and beyond and from the region. And so all that pressure is building up. We have shown incredible restraint in pushing back militarily against Israel, and I think that would cause chaos and havoc in the entire region that the world does not want to see. So we are getting a lot of credit internationally for holding back, and we're translating that credit into things that impact the Syrian people daily lives back home in political and economical and security matters, and in them putting more pressure on Israel. Our stance has made Israel feel very isolated on this issue. When they come to the Security Council, you've heard them. There isn't much that they can say. There isn't any justification for what they're doing, and so we're really succeeding in putting more pressure and alienating them when it comes to this issue, and we will continue to do that.
I think the bottom line here, it appears that Israel does not want stability for Syria, does it?
I mean, some of their politicians said that publicly, that they don't want to see a strong and united and stable Syria. And some columnists wrote about that, but others have said no, it's in the strategic interest for the region that Syria is stable and that we have an address we can speak to and so on. But regardless of that, we are not talking about anything strategic at the moment. What we're talking about is more kind of the tactical situation when it comes to the incursions and going beyond, to Israel returning to the prior to December 8th line.
I want to ask you some more details about what was an apparent mass escape at the Al-Hol detention center. Can you give us some details, actually what happened from your side and what is going on there now?
Sure. So Al-Hol was Al-Hol camp, which is a huge camp in terms of geography and population, was a ticking time bomb. It's an absolute mess from a security perspective in terms of radicalizations and thoughts and so on, and in terms of from a humane and justice perspective, because the vast majority are women and children that are associated or were associated or suspected of being associated with an ISIS fighter at some point in time, and that area was under the control of the SDF. And so when the clashes happened with the SDF and the Syrian army started gaining more land, in collaboration with the United States, we told them that we would like to get control Al-Hol quickly so that nothing can happen. But what happened is that SDF prematurely left their area before we could get there, and unfortunately that's when the escapes happened. But we managed to regain control quite quickly, and we have reallocated a lot of the residents now to a different camp where we are able to secure it more strongly.
Well, because of this incident with the escapees, the European Union has recently expressed major security concerns that this could present the potential to recruit more terrorists. How do you respond to that?
I mean, we have been fighting terrorism and radicalization, and we made that very clear that in terms of fight against terrorism, we have assassinated, detained very senior ISIS fighters in Damascus and beyond. We have lost people including the person who, the security officer Muhammad Massad, who gave his life protecting a church in Aleppo from an ISIS fighter. We joined the anti-ISIS coalition. We've been working on the ground on this. But radicalization goes beyond that. It goes providing economic means, being able to target narratives, and so on. And Syria is still a state that's emerging in terms of its institutions and so on. So the burden is absolutely clear, and we need partners in working on these issues.
You just mentioned the unfortunate death of one of your security personnel. During a recent Daesh attack, you had 4 Syrian security officers that were killed at a checkpoint near Raqqa. Following this, your interior minister said that Daesh is attempting to destabilize Syria. How do you deal with this YPG terrorist group?
Well, there's so many different issues between different armed groups and ISIS and so on. So when it comes to the SDF, for example, we are integrating, and the integration is going well in that sense. There's a lot of tactical stuff. When it comes to ISIS, we are pushing back. We're working with the global coalition and with other actors and taking full responsibility, and a Syrian-led responsibility. Although again, we have weak institutions in terms of the wider state, but the security services are doing everything that they can to push back on this threat and take national ownership in working with international partners.
How difficult a task is it to integrate SDF into the institutions of the new Syrian government?
Well, as you know, it hasn't been easy, and it has been a long process that spanned over a year now, and we've had the deal in late January that seems to be going fine so far. Different parts of Syria live different realities, and so integrating those realities is not easy, but we are hoping that things will continue to be productive.
Now, we'll talk about the relationship between Turkey and Syria. It has been quite a positive one. And of course, we had a recent meeting which is going to result in a economic summit in the spring. Can you tell us more about that?
Well, the relationship with Turkey is, as you indeed said, is a strong one. Turkey was one amongst the first countries to heavily engage with Syria, with the Syrian government, with the new Syrian government. But also, it's one that stood with the Syrian people for many years and took many refugees and took an economic hit because of the situation in Syria, and a national security hit because of the northeast situation. And so they've been engaging, and we've been having a lot of contracts and MOUs and economic collaborations on things, and now the airport and so on. So yes, the ties are quite strong with Turkey, as they are with the wider region, with the Gulf region, with Europe, with the United States, and so on.
You mentioned refugees. How difficult is it to get people back home after being away from home so long, to try to get them back into a war-torn area and back to regular life?
Well, many Syrians have already returned, and that's what people do not notice. 1.5 million Syrians already returned to Syria. So the challenge is not actually getting them back home. The challenge is making it sustainable back home for them to stay. At the moment, they're relying on a lot of the social fabrics, but there's but without the help of the world and providing kind of economic support to them, we will not, a lot of Syrians will not be able to stay. And if they leave again, then there's no coming back.
Now, leading up to the fall of the Assad regime, there were countless Security Council meetings, as I'm sure you've seen, where we had countries like the UK saying, we'd be glad to invest in rebuilding Syria, but we want to assure security. How do you address investors and people who want to help Syria rebuild?
I mean, as you rightly said, the first thing is making sure that Syria is secure. The second thing is to make sure that there's equal opportunities, legislative amendments from the former regime, fighting corruption, for example, that was instilled during the regime era. So there's a lot of things that we're doing, but investors are coming, and contracts are coming, and there's a lot of funds coming now from the Gulf in terms of investment into different projects. And so now we're working with a lot of these countries and the investors thereof to be able to have a Syria that's living in pride, not one that is dependent on aid.
The term living in pride, of course, the people that were really abused and hurt the most over the past decade or so were women and children, weren't they?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, Syrian women paid a huge price for what the regime did to Syrians and their children. First of all, the Syrian legal system, there's a lot of kind of focus on the father as the head of the household, legally speaking. So when the father was killed or disappeared in regime cells, the burden, also the legal burden, became on the mothers and the wives. But also they participated in the uprising. They pushed back against the regime. They created victim groups. They were part of civil society. They persevered until the last moment. And now many of them have returned and are playing integral parts.
Before the fall of the Assad regime, you yourself, outside of Syria, were involved in civil law and human rights issues and building towards the day of the Assad regime collapsing, weren't you?
Well, we never imagined, at some point in time, we never imagined that the day would come that the regime would collapse. So what we were doing in terms of accountability and building cases and working with international institutions was because we thought that it's important to stand up for victims and stand up for survivors and stand up to the rule-based order. But the idea of a transition happening, no one ever imagined that.
Where were you on December 8th?
I was in Doha on December 8th at the Doha Forum. And I remember, us watching those 11 days really unfold and us figuring out. I remember that Saturday evening where we all sat together with some friends and Syrian friends. And Sunday morning, when the regime fell, I put on the new Syrian flag, the green flag, and I went to the Doha Forum, and I was getting hugs and salutes from people that I don't know, right? Because it was such a big moment. And I remember being in an interview like this, where I was tearing up and sobbing, and that to the extent that the presenter had to switch between me and the other guest, who was also sobbing, who's now a minister, Minister Hind Qabawat. So it was a big moment. But then the question was, what do we do next? And this is where I decided to go down to Damascus and door knock and introduce myself and say, look, this is my background. How can I help the new Syria? And how can I help Syrians and, help Syrians really recover from everything that they've been through? And that's what I've been trying to do here as the UN ambassador.
There's got to be a sense of such personal accomplishment that you've been working so hard behind the scenes before this all happened, and now you get to implement that.
Absolutely. There's a sense of accomplishment. There's also a sense of pride and a sense of, yes, there's a lot of challenges, but now we're tackling them with pride and with happiness. It doesn't make it easy. Sometimes being an advocate is easier because you can call out the things that you would like to change and so on. Now I have to implement what those are advocating with me on. It's not an easy task, and it requires someone to constantly make sure that they're not in their own bubble and listen to so many different perspectives, but also not let these different perspectives get to a decision fatigue situation.
Final question. What is the thing you need most from the United Nations and its agencies?
We need the support, economic support, funding support, but also for us to be, for Syria to really turn the trauma that it had into a success story on so many different files, and to take responsibility where things don't go well, which is expected in transitions, but it's how we react to them. So the role of the United Nations, both as a place where we could speak and explain, both where we can meet different states, but also the Secretariat playing a role in development and supporting us through this transition, is something that is absolutely key.
Ambassador Ibrahim Olabi from Syria's mission to the UN. Thank you for joining us here on TRT World.
Thank you for having me.